Good afternoon. I'm Alexandra Williams. I'm a senior attorney here at Osorio, and I'm with Simon Sandoval-Moshenberg, our head of our litigation team at Osorio and a partner at the firm. And we'd like to talk to you a little about the new rule restricting asylum at the US-Mexico border. I thought the best use of our time would be to ask Simon some questions as he is our resident expert. So Simon, in a couple of sentences, what is the new border policy? What is this executive order that's just come out?
Sure. So the biggest problem that this administration has had is that the capacity to process individuals coming through the US-Mexico border seeking various different forms of protection, including especially asylum, the capacity has been outnumbered by the number of individuals requesting asylum. These are mostly not folks who are trying to sneak across the border and are just getting caught. These are folks who are coming to the border with the express purpose of turning themselves into immigration so that they can start the legal process to request asylum. And US asylum law is very clear that if you are on the territory of the United States, even if you're 15 feet into the territory of the United States, having been here for 15 minutes, you can request asylum. But there are certain procedures that you have to go through first to sort of open the door to request asylum. What this rule purports to do is to make it a lot more difficult to get through that initial screening process so that you can get through into sort of full asylum proceedings.
Okay, and when did this go into effect, or has it already gone into effect?
The rule is in effect. It went into effect at midnight on June 5th. And so it has been in effect. It's only been in effect for about 12 days now. And so, as with anything in immigration, there's really two things. There's the law and the policies that are written down on paper, and then there's what actually happens on the ground. So I can tell you a bit about the former, since we've now had almost 2 weeks to sort of read and digest this new policy. But as to the latter, as to what's actually happening on the ground, how it's being implemented, we're still just learning. We're just starting to learn what's going on.
Is there any, there was another kind of big rule we had on the border last year. That was the final rule published by kind of combo DOJ DHS initiative around the circumvention of lawful pathways. Is this executive order complementary? Is it different? What would you say to that?
Yeah, they really sort of beef each other up, and this is sort of the circumvention of lawful pathways rule on steroids. So the main innovation of the Biden administration when it comes to people on the US-Mexico border seeking asylum, the main innovation is actually a smartphone app called CBP-1. And if you're in northern Mexico, you can use the CBP-1 smartphone app to request an appointment to go to a US border port of entry and conduct your interview there and request asylum by means of an appointment instead of by means of, sort of chaotically crossing the border between ports of entry. That's a fantastic idea, right? I mean, like, we do appointments in all sorts of things in life. The problem is that there's nowhere near enough appointments. The CBP-1 app right now is giving out less than 1,500 appointments a day. And meanwhile, there are several thousand more people than that who are waiting in northern Mexico. So right now, it's estimated that if you want to use the CBP-1 app to request an appointment, you can end up waiting several months. And that's really, for a lot of people with small children, people who don't actually have any legal permission to be in Mexico in the first place, it's really untenable and they're not able to do that. Another problem is, of course, the CBP-1 app does certainly require a certain level of literacy, a certain level of technical fluency that a lot of folks, especially, for example, indigenous folks who speak indigenous Guatemalan languages, for example, don't really have that. Under the Biden rule, under the 2023 Biden rule, if you didn't use the CBP-1 app to request an appointment, you had certain penalties levied against you, and you were subject to a much higher standard. But there were lots of exceptions written under that rule. And one of those exceptions was, for example, the app's not made available in a language that I speak. But that was one of the exceptions. Or there were exceptional circumstances, mitigating circumstances like a medical emergency, something like that. This rule doesn't have those exceptions. So it really does significantly throttle off the number of people who are allowed to claim asylum to that less than 1,500 people a day who can get an appointment through the CBP1 app. And if you can't do it, it makes things really, really, really very difficult for you.
So what do you see as, and with the knowledge that we only have had this rule for the past, better part of 2 weeks, what do you see as like the major ramifications or impacts that are going to happen as a result of this rule or this order?
Yeah, so first let me explain first what the rule is doing, and then I'll explain what the rule actually isn't doing. So what the rule does do is for people who come to the United States between the ports of entry seeking asylum, first of all, for those people, instead of the Border Patrol agent asking them, would you like to have an initial screening to see if you might be able to apply for asylum in the United States, they're going to be subject to what's called the shout test. It's a kind of funny term, but it literally means they have to shout, "I'm afraid," right? "Don't send me back. Someone's trying to kill me there." Something of that nature, right? People will have to affirmatively ask for a fear interview, or they're not going to get one, right? They're not going to be asked, "Are you afraid of being sent back?" So if someone just sort of stays quiet, they'll be sent back. That's sort of the idea of it. This is, of course, extremely, pernicious, especially, again, to people who don't even speak Spanish as a first language, maybe because they're indigenous Guatemalans, to people who sort of, just don't understand the process and are sort of waiting to be told what to do. If they don't affirmatively speak up and say, "I want an interview," they won't get one. That's a big change from previous policy where everyone was asked, "Are you afraid to return to your home country?" So obviously this leads to sort of the first point of advice, which is, if you or a loved one are planning on crossing the border anytime soon, shout it out, speak up as early and often as possible and say, "I want a fear interview. I'm afraid. Don't send me back. I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm afraid." Just say it to every single Border Patrol agent and CBP agent who you come across, and hopefully one of them will correctly do their job and schedule you for an interview. But then what happens at the interview, this is really the big change, not just sort of how do you get an interview, but what happens at the interview. People are being held to a much, much higher standard. The old standard was essentially if you can state a reasonable possibility, right? You tell your story to the interviewer, and the interviewer says, "Yeah, that sounds like you might win asylum. We'll let you have a chance to apply." The new standard is much higher. Essentially, you have to prove to the interviewer that you likely will win asylum. This is very difficult. I mean, remember that these interviews are done really, really quickly after someone is apprehended by immigration. It can be literally within a matter of hours or on a next day basis. It's done in Border Patrol custody, so people don't have physical access to lawyers. So it's very important if you're considering crossing, or if you have a loved one who's considering crossing and they want to engage in one of these fear interviews, they want to request one of these fear interviews, don't wait till you get the interview scheduled, because it could be finding a lawyer. So that's what it does, right? It changes how you get an interview, and it significantly raises the standard for what happens at the interview and how tough it is to pass the interview. Here's what it doesn't do. It doesn't allow for more non-Mexican nationals to be removed to Mexico. So, I mean, I will tell you that at our office, we see lots of people who, due to just operational constraints, Homeland Security didn't have the physical capacity to give them an interview. And so they sort of waived the interview and put them through to proceedings. That's still happening, and it's still going to happen based on sort of the operational realities of, so few agents, so few interviewers, so little time. so many crossers. So that is definitely still happening. And then the final thing that we really don't know is, and this is what I'm personally far and away the most worried about. Okay, so for the folks who make it through the interview, right, these heightened interviews, or for the folks who, maybe even aren't apprehended, and so for whatever reason they're sent to, or they're apprehended, but then the interview is waived and they're sent through to court. What's the standard going to be finally in court when they're trying to prove their asylum cases and win asylum case in the United States? Is it going to be a much higher standard? And the answer is simply, we don't know yet, and we're still sort of waiting for more details on that.
So if someone were to request an interview, get an interview, not pass an interview, do they have any kind of recourse in terms of appealing that decision, and what are the next steps for them?
Yeah, if you are scheduled for one of these interviews, they're called fear interviews, and you don't pass your credible fear interview, you have the right and really should request review by an immigration judge. And that's supposed to happen within 10 days. It usually does. Sometimes they take a little longer. And there, the judge reviews the notes from the interview, but also you have the right at a credible fear review in front of an immigration judge. You have the right to say whatever it is you want to say to the judge. And if you have something you want to add, you should, make sure to speak up. Don't wait to be asked. Make sure to speak up and say, I'd like to sort of add to my testimony at the interview. But that's it. If you don't pass in front of the immigration judge, there is very explicitly no right of appeal to federal court. You can't take it up to the Court of Appeals, anything like that. So you really do get those two chances, and that's it. And after that, they can and will remove you to your home country without any further legal process, and there's no process to get it set aside. If you do the review in front of the immigration judge and you don't pass, the immigration judge upholds the finding of no credible fear. You then have 7 days to request reconsideration from USCIS, not from the judge, but from the USCIS Asylum Office. 7 days is a very short period of time. And if they happen to remove you prior to the expiration of those 7 days, which they might, depending on what country you're from, that sort of cuts off the review period short. So with extremely limited rights of review. So definitely for people for whom it is possible, in a way, that's the best thing to do. If you log on, if you're in northern Mexico and you log on to CBP1 and you see that there's a long wait, you think, I'd really much rather not wait. I'd really rather just sort of try my luck, but across the border, there's a very good chance that things are going to go very, very, very badly for you. Whereas if you're able to make the CBP1 app appointment and come in through that appointment, none of these new rules apply to you, right? It's still the old asylum rules. If you really can't wait for some very, very, very specific reason, you're going to need to document that, right? Like, for example, you're with your child and your child is extremely sick and needs medical attention in the United States. You're going to need to document that as best as possible so that later, if an officer or an interviewer or an immigration judge is asking, well, why didn't you use the CBP1 app? Instead of just saying things, you'll actually have some evidence.
I was reading about the rule and how, the capacity specifics. And there seems to be some kind of idea that it's a temporary thing. If we get our numbers down to a certain point, it'll go away. If the numbers go back up, it'll come back. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is a temporary permanent situation. Like so many things in immigration law, it's created as supposedly temporary, but the way in which it's created makes it clear that it's really anything but. Supposedly, if the monthly average of if a 14-day average of border crossings drops below 1,500, the rule goes away, right? And they can stop doing this rule. That has never happened in the last 6 years. In every month but one, in the last 6 years, border crossings have been in excess of 1,500 per day, right? So the notion that this is somehow going to stop happening because people are going to stop crossing the border as a result of this rule is, I mean, just patently counterfactual. It's ridiculous, right? The only thing that would actually work is dramatically increasing the number of CBP1 appointments through that app, right? If they could get those appointments up from 1,400 a day to like 3,000 a day, then, you know, this would be a reasonable option for people, and we might see a significant decrease in the number of people crossing the border illegally. But of course, that, you know, more appointments requires more officers to carry out those appointments, and they haven't been able to do that yet. But this is a supposedly temporary rule that, at least as things are currently going, will be on the books for, you know, basically forever.
Do you envision any challenges to this rule?
The ACLU has already filed a legal challenge. I think there are one or two other legal challenges that have been filed. This is going to be battled out in the courts. There may be injunctions, right? Those injunctions may be overturned. You know, keep posted, keep watching this space. But as of today, which is the 18th of June, 3 p.m., this rule is currently in effect and is being applied.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your expertise and your analysis, and we'll look forward to hearing more news, hopefully better news in the future. Thank you.
My pleasure.